So if our fighting video included my boy Heracross, then it's only rightfully so that our psychic video includes Wobbuffet. How's that? We're back today with another typing video looking at the top 5 best psychic Pokemon in the Nightmare Cup. Now, I do have a short disclaimer. All the data from this video is either from my own personal spreadsheets that I created, which you can find down in the description, or if it's simulation based or anything like that, it's all from pvpoke.com. All right, and all these simulations have been run with a 1 versus 1 shield situation. Got it. So really fast, let's actually look at our bulk and our stat product for the top 5 psychic Pokemon. Now, this information does come from my spreadsheets, and basically it's just filtered to kind of figure out what stat product and what amount of bulk each Pokemon has, and then I just rank them simply based on that. So when we talk about bulk, we actually have Wobbuffet coming in at the top spot here. Hypno, Claydol, Bronzong, and Metang all follow, respectively, in order. Now, when we talk about stat product, Claydol actually bumps up to the #1 spot. And Claydol, being pretty bulky as is pretty nice to see that he jumps up to that top spot there. I think that Claydol may have some specialty cases in this cup if a certain Pokemon ends up becoming super prevalent. We'll get to that. Hypno, Bronzong, Grumpig, and Slowbro all end up coming in as the other stat product candidates there. Now, Slowbro and Slowking do have the same stats, so you can kind of count both of those there as the 5th slot. Now, in terms of viability, all of this comes from pvpoke.com, and when I say viability, I mean how viable are they and what do they cover the most. So each one of these Pokemon are viable because they end up covering the most amount of matches possible in the psychic typing. So looking at our top spot, we actually end up having a Alolan Raichu here coming out on top. Now, this is with Spark, Wild Charge, and Thunder Punch as our moveset here. Now, the reason that I think this Pokemon is at the top of the list is simply because it has the ability to just do a ton of neutral damage to a lot of the meta. There are a few picks that end up getting dealt super effective damage, but it's mainly a ton of neutral damage. And it's really powerful right here because of this typing in this meta. It's all basically rock, paper, scissors on which typing you have. Alolan Raichu being the interesting one here, being able to deal a ton of neutral damage to a lot of the types actually inside of this meta. Next, we actually have Xatu, and Xatu actually ends up having Air Slash, Ominous Wind, and Aerial Ace. So having access to the flying type moves really helps us in a lot of the fighting type matchups, which we've already talked about in a previous video. Having Ominous Wind also helps us cover a lot of the psychic matchups, which is just really good. That's a really powerful combination to have, because we're going to be able to resist a ton of the psychic damage coming in while be able to deal super effective damage to 2 of the other typings that are basically going to be going up against us. Next, we actually end up having Hypno, which ends up having Confusion, Shadow Ball, and Focus Blast. Now, Hypno is kind of cool. Unfortunately, Shadow Ball and Focus Blast kind of going to be hard to come by. Shadow Ball, being Legacy, is going to be really hard to get. For me, I don't have anybody that even... Before I got back into Pokemon Go, we didn't even have like Drowsy in the Pokedex, so no one in my local group really has any kind of Hypno action going on. But Confusion, Shadow Ball, and Focus Blast is really powerful because Confusion will actually end up hurting your fighting types. Shadow Ball will actually end up hurting the psychic types, and then Focus Blast ends up targeting the dark types. So Hypno is almost like the ultimate toolbox inside of this meta. Very cool. Moving on, we actually have Bronzong in our 4th slot. Bronzong actually carrying Confusion, Heavy Slam, and Flash Cannon. Now, I'm not a big believer in having both of those charge moves. I mean, in certain situations I can see the merit, but basically Heavy Slam is going to be the one that's most commonly used, And then Flash Cannon is actually going to be there for some of the just outright hard-hitting moves that you need. So basically whenever you just want to pummel in tons of damage, you can throw out Flash Cannon instead of Heavy Slam to kind of just drive home the fact that, hey, I got some damage coming your way. Lastly, we do end up having Gallade as our 5th most viable slot here. So Gallade having access to Confusion, Leaf Blade, and Close Combat is quite interesting. And here again, this one's kind of cool because Confusion ends up hurting your fighting types. Leaf Blade is pretty neutral to most of the meta. There are a couple of situations where it ends up doing super effective damage. And then Close Combat actually ends up targeting the dark types. So while you're actually able to do super effective damage to 2 out of the 3, you have a neutral damage at least to the other typing that you don't have a super effective answer for. So very, very cool. Now let's actually move on to our matchups here. So of course this does look like a ton of jargon written on this board, but I do feel like most of it is very, very important to take away from this video. So let's actually start with our most viable Pokemon here, Alolan Raichu. Now each slot here is a different typing. So we're going to start with our dark types, going to move into psychics, and then lastly finish up on our fighting types. So with Alolan Raichu, we actually end up having favorable matchups up against both Alolan Muck and Crawdaunt. Now, Crawdaunt is going to end up taking super effective damage because he does carry the water typing, but as you can see, Alolan Muck actually ends up carrying a neutral situation from our damage. Considering we have all electric moves, we actually end up doing pretty good up against that simply because we have the neutral damage to output. Now, we do end up falling to both Alolan Raticate and Umbreon. Both of those being really tanky dark types. They can just end up withstanding more damage than we can output while being able to pretty much just overwhelm us with either neutral damage with their normal type moves or with just an insane amount of pressure. Moving on to our psychic types here. So we do actually end up winning against both Gardevoir and Mr. Mime, which if you remember from the fighting type videos, both of those kept appearing quite often in our matchups. So it's nice to see that Alolan Raichu is able to withstand a lot of that psychic damage being resisted by our own typing there, and being able to outcome that match is pretty nice. Now we do end up falling to both Claydol and Bronzong, which is kind of interesting because Claydol does appear on these bulk and stat product lists pretty high, and Bronzong is actually one of our other most viable Pokemon here. So the fact that whenever we have a more viable Pokemon being beaten by a less viable Pokemon, it ends up becoming kind of a anti-meta pick in certain situations. Moving on to our fighters here, Alolan Raichu has no problem going up against the fighting types. Lucario, Heracross, Poliwrath, and Hitmonlee all end up just falling. If I'm not mistaken, Raichu doesn't lose to a single fighting type Pokemon. Now moving on to our fighting type, Alolan Raichu has no problem with the fighting types. Things like Lucario, Heracross, Poliwrath, and Hitmonlee all end up falling to our Alolan Raichu. Now, there are a few caveats to this. Things like Breloom, Gallade, Hitmonchan, and even Toxicroak all will end up tying up against the Alolan Raichu there. So you have to kind of keep that in mind, that it's not as clear cut with Alolan Raichu, but he does have very favorable matchups to the majority of the fighting types. Moving on to Xatu here. So Xatu is getting a lot of attention right now because his little package that he has is very interesting. He has a lot of interesting use cases in this cup very early on. When we're talking specifically about the dark types though, he does end up beating Shiftry, but he does lose to more than half of the dark types here. So Tyranitar, Alolan Raticate, and Skuntank all end up doing really well up against our Xatu there. Now, in terms of psychic types, we're pretty much even here. So Gallade and Gardevoir end up having a really hard time beating our Xatu, while Alolan Raichu and Hypno end up giving us tons of problems as we're trying to beat them. In terms of our fighting types, Poliwrath is the only one that really ends up getting to us here, whereas Lucario, Breloom, and Heracross aren't really that big of a problem. Moving on to Hypno here, so Hypno and Bronzong both here, you can see all of the darks is kind of a big deal. So we, as Hypno, don't beat a single dark type in a 1 versus 1 shield situation at all. At all, right? So that's scary knowing that you don't have a fighting chance up against any of the dark types is really scary. That makes Hypno a little bit more of a specialty pick towards the psychic types and even the fighting types here. Kind of scary. Our best matchup with the dark types, even with Hypno, is up against Absol. And Absol just... it's not even like close. Like Absol wins with just under 50% health, and it's not even close. Like, it's a really, really hard battle to go with Hypno up against any of the dark types. It's not... I personally would not recommend going up against the dark types with Hypno. If they can force you to switch into Hypno and they end up bringing out a dark type, then it's going to be a rough game. Like, it's really going to suck. But Hypno up against the psychic typers here, so Slowking and Wobbuffet are no problem for Hypno. Having access to the Shadow Ball really ends up helping us a lot. But things like Bronzong and Chimecho can actually end up beating a Hypno, which is interesting. Bronzong, not as much because it can resist a ton of the psychic type damage from our fast moves. Plus, we don't really have too much that's actually going to be like super effective towards Bronzong. But Chimecho is kind of interesting because Chimecho is looked at as almost like a budget Hypno. Has access to almost the same moves. It's got a very similar role. It doesn't have quite the same stats, but they're comparable. But Chimecho actually beats Hypno. Very, very interesting. That could be another anti-meta option here. Now, in the fighting area, we do end up tying up against Lucario. And then we actually straight up beat Heracross, Hitmonchan, and Toxicroak. So, pretty easy feat there. Now, talking about Bronzong here, very similar situation. All of the darks have a really easy matchup up against our Bronzong. As Bronzong, we have a hard time getting over the just sheer amount of dark type power that they can push onto us. Talking about the psychics though, Mr. Mime and Gallade are no problem. Bronzong has kind of a unique situation with his typing, being able to resist a lot, just a pure ton of psychic type damage, means that these fast moves that these Pokemon carry are just not going to be a big deal. Especially like Gallade, even though Gallade carries fighting type moves, when we're talking about our most viable position, Confusion, Leaf Blade, and Close Combat are definitely his most viable moveset. So we end up getting a ton of resisted damage up against the Bronzong, which means Bronzong can kind of overwhelm us there. Although Bronzong does end up losing to both Xatu and Alolan Raichu, as you can see, those are the neutral type, fast type moves that are going up against him. Xatu using the Air Slash and Alolan Raichu using that Spark. Moving on to our fighting types, so kind of interesting here, Lucario is a tie. And I'm pretty sure that's simply because Lucario just overwhelms Bronzong with a ton of fighting type damage. But he's the only one that we tie against, and we beat every other fighter. So now, based on our fighting type video, you can kind of see like Lucario does end up having a ton of these tie situations, whereas a lot of the other fighters are just clear-cut, like easy wins. So while I was talking about how Lucario is very good, he's not necessary. This is where he really starts to show his worth. Moving on, lastly, to our big boy Gallade here. Gallade is one that I'm very closely looking at. I think that Gallade is really, really cool, being the fact that we haven't had any like big issues out of Gallade yet. I'm really interested to see how well he'll end up doing. Up against the dark types though, Absol and Weavile, not a problem here. Having access to that fighting typing as well as the psychic ends up having a really interesting effect on some of these Pokemon. But things like Shiftry and Honchkrow have no problem getting over us though. Shiftry being able to output just tons of neutral damage, and Honchkrow being able to deal super effective damage with its flying type moves ends up giving us a lot of problem. As far as our psychics go, Alakazam does actually give Gallade no problem here. Slowbro and Slowking also are no problem for Gallade, but Xatu and Bronzong both give us quite a bit of issues. Xatu being able to just output super effective damage with its flying type, and Bronzong just purely resisting a ton of our own damage. Onto the fighting types though, we actually have really favorable matchups up against all of the fighting types. Poliwrath, Lucario, Machoke, Hitmonlee are some of the best matchups that we actually end up having as Gallade. So, in terms of Psychics, this is kind of interesting because a lot of the big powerhouses aren't really showing up here. Maybe if it was a different situation with some of the bands being different, or maybe Psychic type is just completely hindered. Well, however you want to look at it, it's very interesting that these 5 show up as the top 5 viable Pokemon. Like, whenever I think of Psychic types, especially like in this meta, I would have thought Metagross would have done better. Alakazam would have done better. I mean, there's so many other Pokemon. I really thought Gardevoir was going to rank higher on this list. Mr. Mime seems really good. Espeon seems really good. But all of those Pokemon don't end up having as good of a coverage as these Pokemon do. They really outperform a lot of the other Psychic-type Pokemon in general. Now, of course, none of this means that these are the top 5 Pokemon that you have to put on your team. There are several specialty situations where other Pokemon will work out very well. Chimecho seems to be a really good specialty pick. Gardevoir seems to be a really good specialty pick after doing this video. Kadabra would be really good, especially having access to Shadow Ball and Dazzling Gleam. That's pretty interesting for Kadabra. And Alakazam even. So Alakazam has access to Fire Punch. Like, that's weird. That's such a cool off kind of meta pick, but it ends up giving him a lot of neutral coverage to a lot of the other meta picks that can actually end up doing him really well. If you think about, he's actually going to be able to use Fire Punch up against Lucario. That's super cool. So, other than that, there's not like too much to be said about the Psychic types. They're huge, they're big, they're good, but the biggest takeaway from this video is taking a look at these top 5 Pokemon and kind of figuring out, do I want to use any of these 5? I might actually end up trying to do a team composition video this month, simply to just kind of show how I go about building a team of 6 and kind of figuring out what is the most effective strategy to have general coverage versus having specialty picks, because I think there's a nice balance that you need to have between both of those to make a really like harmonious type team, if that makes any sense. So, but that is actually all that I have for the Psychic types today, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out. Thank you so much for watching. Always remember, if you have any deep dive suggestions, please let me know down in the comments below. We are going to start working through those as soon as I get through with the Dark type video, which you should see tomorrow. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you like to like videos, make sure you do that. If you don't, you can be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in those comments below. And until our next video, I will catch you then.